A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Monday afternoon and the start of another work week. I know it's been a bit strange for absolutely everyone, but we are all adapting. Happy Monday. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is the ongoing webinar series organized by the Institute of Corporate Directors. So thank you very much, as I have been, to ICDM for helping to facilitate all of this. And thank you, all of your attendees, for joining us. We have been enjoying all the lively discussions that we've been having so far and hope to continue that this week. Before I go on and introduce our speaker today, a bit of housekeeping. On your Zoom tab at the bottom, you can see two tabs. One is for Q&A and one is for chat. If you have any questions for our speaker, please type them into the Q&A tab. We'll answer them at the end of his session. But if you're having any technical difficulties, you want to give us some feedback or check out some of the other lively discussions that we've been having on the side, please feel free to drop us a chat. This session, by the way, is recorded and it will be sent to you once it is over. And of course, if you wish to leave the webinar session for whatever reason, you will be able to rejoin if the webinar is still in progress. So without further ado, we actually welcome Host UK, Executive Director, Risk Advisory, Cyber Risk for Deloitte Malaysia. To say that his topic is timely, I think it doesn't even do it justice. He will be talking about cybersecurity considerations amid a global pandemic. Now, as organizations and governments all over the world work to fight the pandemic, this urgency has maybe scarily or possibly left loopholes that allows scammers and possible black hats to take advantage by stoking fear, because what they do is they stoke fear in order that they will actually get a foothold in. And that is the one thing that I think we're all very, very concerned about as we work remotely and take more of our systems out of buildings. The question now is not only how do we protect ourselves now, in the now moment, but how do we keep protecting ourselves when this is all over and we are faced with whatever new normal we have. I hand it over now to Suke for his insights.
Hello. Hi, Nadia. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, but sadly we can't see you.
Okay. I think someone stopped the video, so I can't start it. But it's okay. I don't.
We'll get a bit of technical difficulties. We'll try and do that. But there we see you. All right, please go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is a bit unusual for me. I do have to apologize in advance. So naturally, I'm working from home. For various reasons, I don't have quite the luxury of working from a locked room, and I have two very young sons. So one or both of them may actually come in and disrupt at any time. So I apologize in advance. Okay, so I will go directly to my topic. And before that, I suppose I'd like to just say, I hope everybody's staying safe wherever you are, whether at work or at home. Let's talk about cybersecurity. So I will turn on my slide. Nadia, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We're just waiting for you to make it full screen.
And now?
Yep, we're good. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So my topic is cybersecurity considerations amid a global pandemic and extraordinary events. So I don't think we need to talk about what's happening in the world right now, COVID-19, everybody is aware. And Nadia, you also mentioned that we do recognize that cybersecurity is a hot topic, so that does not need any further introduction. So what I'll talk through today is a few things. And here are my discussion points. So the first is we're going to talk about some of the heightened security challenges faced by organizations amidst extraordinary events. And so we live in a time where this is unprecedented. Nobody really knows what to do, either from the medical front or in most cases, even from a work/IT security perspective as well. So ultimately, we do face a new type of life and also heightened security challenges. I want to talk about activities initiated by threat actors to take advantage of the current pandemic situation. Now, Nadia, you mentioned that this is a timely topic, it's a hot topic, and everybody, of course, if you've been reading the media, would know that there is a, I guess, heightened threat level in terms of cybersecurity. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you some of the actual threats that we see out there. And finally, we talk a bit about steps that organizations may consider to sustain organizational cybersecurity during periods of disrupted business operations. So we know that this situation we're in right now, we're not by any means finished. This may continue weeks ahead, months ahead, years ahead, who knows. So ultimately, organizations would probably need to think about how do we still sustain our cybersecurity operations, our cybersecurity controls, even whilst we operate at half mass, operate at half capacity, and even with the budget constraints that may face us in the future. I do wish to make a point that this discussion, given that we are in the midst of battling COVID-19, is what I'll focus on. But most of what I'm talking about today actually applies to any extraordinary event, and we'll look at some examples of that. So, rather timely, on Friday, when our dear Prime Minister extended the MCO for further 2 weeks, he used this term, a new normal. So we can no longer perhaps be going out like we used to. We can no longer be shaking hands like we used to. And it's something that we all need to adjust to going forward. And the same applies to cybersecurity. So as an introduction, there will be a new normal in cybersecurity. And the key for us as defenders, would be to think about how do we anticipate these challenges and perhaps act now. Now, there are a lot of things to consider. Obviously, cybersecurity is a very wide topic. But today I'll focus on a few key high-level themes that we can highlight. So my main slide focuses on this template here, where we will talk about the new normal. We'll talk about trends, we'll talk about the impact and the consideration. So if you look on the left-hand side, I will first introduce to you what the trend is. I will then talk about what the cybersecurity impact is in relation to that trend. And finally, we'll talk about the considerations. What do we as organizations perhaps consider and do in order to address these trends and impacts? And when we talk about these trends, impact, and considerations, that generally we have two classes, and it's not a situation where you can actually bucket each of the trends into each of these two categories. So it's somewhere along the continuum. But ultimately, we will need to think about the immediate impact. So what are we facing right now? And how do we actually react to the temporary disruption that has hit us even as we sit here today? But there's also a longer term impact, and that really thinks through how do we actually react to the new economic climate that we may face. I'm going to talk through a few themes as well, focus on questions. And the first one is, how has COVID-19 impacted our work culture and changed cybersecurity? So this one, I'm sure everybody knows, remote working. So half or more of the world is probably on lockdown at the moment. A lot of people are working from home. And so this represents a shift in what organizations will face. And the first issue is, of course, there will be greater remote access demands to test VPN bandwidth and controls. So if you think about it, if your whole organization or virtually all your organization is working from home right now, can your virtual private networks, can your remote access systems actually take that kind of bandwidth? And if you don't actually address it, it may actually leave part of your workforce being unable to actually work from home. There's also the consideration of controls. So in the past, we may have thought, okay, maybe remote access is something we don't actually give to our employees. So maybe controls in that area may have perhaps dropped off the radar slightly, but all of a sudden we need to then invoke remote access. We need to then invoke VPN. And as a result of that, doing that hastily may have actually caused us to lose sight of some of the controls which may be needed for secure remote access of our employees. The next thing to also think about in terms of the impact of remote working is that some technology implementations are fast-tracked. So think about it. If If you suddenly need to allow your employees to access your network using their personal mobile devices, and you haven't allowed that before, these mobile devices may also be compromised. They may not be subject to the same stringent security as our corporate devices. And so the haste to actually get our workers working remotely may have left us exposed. The one thing that is also very key on everybody's mind, and it's ironic because we're using this software at this point in time, is of course Zoom. So in the rush to allow workers to work remotely, a lot of organizations have rolled out collaboration tools and video conferencing tools such as Zoom. And Zoom is, of course, in the news lately because, of course, that there is a heightened degree of usage in that software. And it's, of course, been publicly made known that there are loads of security vulnerabilities in Zoom. And I'll make the point also that often when you use software like Zoom or any other software, there are considerations to think about in that there are secure ways to use software, right? So for the most simple one was when we started using Zoom, maybe no one thought about putting in a password. Now everybody puts in a password. And there are a lot of other configurations you can actually put into Zoom to make it a bit more secure. Nonetheless, this has been in the news for very, very negative reasons. And so that leads me to the considerations of this first trend. So we first of all need to ensure that we review the remote access or VPN security posture as we allow our workers to work from home. Things that we need to consider include things like patching. Have we patched our VPN systems? Multi-factor authentication. Do we actually require our employees to put in a second layer of authentication before allowing them access to the corporate network? And of course, as I mentioned earlier, security configurations. You putting on settings that may help secure particular technologies. And the next thing is, I know we were obviously trying to rush a lot of technologies to allow remote working. But now, since everybody is working from home, we should also take the opportunity to think about the threat and risk assessments for the new technology that we've adopted. So say, for instance, we've implemented Zoom or whatever collaboration tool that we wanted to use. I think now is the time to probably think about, should we still continue or should we switch to something else? And it's important consideration to actually take. So moving on to the next trend is what we call availability disruptions. And I'm referring to this in the context of cybersecurity staff availability. So cybersecurity is something which, well, needs people to ultimately run. And even as people work from home, there's a question on, and regardless of whether this is cybersecurity or whether just normal work, how effective are we at working from home? I know for myself, I'm probably only working at maybe 40, 50% efficiency because of the disruptions I face. And ultimately, this applies to cybersecurity staff, where their availability and productivity may be impacted by exceptional family care needs, right? They may not always be available 24/7 or even 8 hours a day to actually respond to cybersecurity threats. And ultimately, then we need to think about if we are working with a reduced cybersecurity workforce and people have to take time off on and off, we have to think about prioritizing critical security operations. Think about all the things that we do in cybersecurity today, which ones are the most critical and which ones we can potentially let go. And how we plan that also needs to tie in to a focus on protecting the crown jewels. Now, as I mentioned, we live in an unprecedented situation. Our aspirations of protecting everything within our organization probably has to go out the window. So we do need to think about what are the most important things that we need to protect. What are the things that if, for example, gets leaked out to the public domain, or we don't have access to, can actually lead to full operations of our organization going down, and also lead to huge reputational and financial impacts. And in doing this, in focusing on the crown jewels, we then have to think also on what do we need to shut down in terms of systems and cybersecurity if they are not essential. So ultimately, prioritize our critical security operations, but focus on protecting our crown jewels. Next, the next theme. So we've talked about how remote working, working from home, staff availabilities are impacting us in cybersecurity. The next more immediate thing, and this is probably on the top of everybody's mind, is how are cyber criminals and other malicious actors taking advantage of this COVID-19 situation? And you're all here because you've heard news. Well, increase in clickbait and social engineering, that's obvious, but how are they doing this? And ultimately, there is an uptick in socially engineered cybersecurity attacks, trying to take advantage of this situation to make financial gains. For example, make you perhaps donate to to someone under the guise of donating to someone, but actually you transfer that money to a cyber criminal. And also, it's a good time to actually try to achieve what the cyber criminal has been trying to achieve all this while. So often they are looking for to steal personally identifiable information, and now is probably a good time to actually strike. So the question then, why strike now? And for all of us who don't know, we often talk about Sun Tzu in his publication, the Art of War, and he talks about two things, momentum and timing of strikes. And the simple premise is as we all face this challenge of battling COVID 19, the momentum, the number of people we can potentially attack right now is unprecedented. So by attacking now, you will reach a very big momentum and will be able to attack more people than you ever have before. And the second point is around timing of the strike, right? So as you'll see later on that as people are more and more desperate for information, for safety, they will actually fall prey to easily to these cyber tricks that are deployed by cyber criminals. And as we know, recently it was reported that cybersecurity cases are up by 82.5% in Malaysia. But this is not just, as I mentioned earlier, not limited to COVID-19. And to prove that, here is something back from 2011. So at the time during the war on terrorism, when Osama bin Laden was cornered and shot dead, there were, of course, Facebook postings by cyber criminals having links where if you click on it, you could see a video of bin Laden being killed. And obviously those links will contain malware. The other one, if you remember back to, I think, 2011, 2012, there were a lot of people who faced travel restrictions in Iceland and Europe because of the volcano. So at that point in time, a lot of the cyber criminals actually took the opportunity to actually send emails, SMSs, and try and trick people into contributing money, saying they're from the police, etc. So in that situation, they also took advantage of that situation. The interesting thing was this in this case was a lot of the cyber criminals were found out because the name of the volcano was actually pretty hard to spell. And so once the police got wind of that, they issued advisories which said that if you see the spelling is wrong and we as police won't actually get it wrong, it's probably a phishing or scam email. But back to COVID-19, right? We now see a lot of themed phishing and malware attacks, which raises the cyber risk levels. So this advisory here is from the US Department of Homeland Security. They have a cybersecurity infrastructure security agency called CISA, and jointly it was issued together with UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. So in their advisory, it actually gave examples of the phishing scenarios that the attackers are actually using right now. So they would send emails having phishing email subject lines such as 2020 coronavirus updates, 2019 nCoV, etc. And in those emails, of course, as is natural, they would embed some sort of malware into it or trick the victim into visiting a website, trying to steal valuable information, trying to get people to input their login credentials and all that, stealing all that information. An example here is on the right from an actual example from Italy, where someone actually pretended to impersonate a reputable doctor, of course, having some sort of malware embedded into the message. Click on that message on that file in the link, infects your machine. And these are also examples of how these cyber criminals will actually operate by impersonating authorities. So on the left-hand side, World Health Organization. On the right-hand side, a particular well-known Singapore specialist. Modus operandi is the same, getting you to click on a link, or either that or embedding some sort of malware attachment into the document. Here is something from the UK government. And if you look at your phones right now, you also see similar message from Majlis Keselamatan Negara, telling you about the recent MCO, etc. And so the UK government also has these SMS notices, and cyber criminals, of course, have learned how to tap onto that. So an example here is sending an SMS to people saying that certain types of payments are required, right? Click on that link, brings you to a legitimate looking website on the right, and thereafter it purports to ask you for money or either steal your login credentials or other information. It's also from the CISA and UK NCSC. Spoofed COVID-19 domains. So this chart here shows the count of spoofed COVID-19 related domains that we've seen all the way from the last few months. So if you look at the chart here, all the way from November, January, February, and March, a lot of there's a huge uptick in people trying to impersonate a COVID-19 related domain. So for instance, if you had covid19.com, someone may actually spoof the domain by putting it as covid-i9.com, and people may actually accidentally click on those links or navigate to those websites. Examples are on the right, some Chinese websites here where you see actually purported to be legitimate COVID-19 related websites, and the one at the bottom, you'll see that people are trying to sell masks. And of course, the cyber criminal in this case actually had a spelling error. He spelled wholesale wrong. But ultimately, the cyber criminals are trying to use this to attract people to click on these links, go to those websites. And this one is unfortunate, but particularly insidious. So recently, of course, a Czech hospital was hit by a cyber attack whilst they were trying to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak. So ultimately, cyber criminals, threat actors, they're always trying to find what we call the tipping point. The point at which, if you do some sort of action, ransomware, be it ransomware or some sort of threat, the victim will actually bow down to that command. And this is obviously the best time when hospitals are trying to save lives. You attack them with ransomware or some sort of denial of service. Is it likely that the hospital will pay to try and get its access back? More than likely. So it's a great time to carry out these attacks. So ultimately, we will see these attacks going on even now, with a huge uptick even in the medium and maybe long term. So that's the third theme. The one thing that we should also think about in this is as we respond to this, we always need to continually update our security awareness training and education. But you might think, hey, I've always trained my people to actually just know how to identify phishing emails and the like, and they should know. Now, what we need to do right now is to continually provide that awareness and training, which is tailored to the actual schemes and trends that we see right now. So actually have training which actually has screenshots of those actual COVID-19 attacks would be useful. And the other thing would be to have clear guidance and procedures for suspected malware and other incidents. So obviously, when an attack happens, the more people who know about it, the better, so that they can also not fall prey to that attack. And often what you see in organizations is a phishing email happens, someone realizes it or falls for it, but they then don't know who actually in IT or IT security to actually contact. So one of the things to enforce right now is to actually ensure that you've got clear guidance and procedures for if one of your employees actually notes such a security incident, who's the first person they should contact. And that's quite important even as we work remotely. So we talked about how the working from home and cyber criminals are trying to take advantage, but how has the global lockdown and disruption in supply chains also affected cybersecurity? And as a service provider, I know myself that half my workforce providing cybersecurity services to clients is actually immobile right now. And so when we talk about cybersecurity security, supply chain disruption, the cyber impact of this is that the coverage of your security service providers may be affected by quarantine. Think about the service whereby, say, your service provider is actually monitoring your networks for intrusions. If they now have to work from home, if they suffer from the say a confirmed case in their office and the office has to close down, you will also see potentially that impact hitting you in that your service providers may not be able to provide you with those services at any given point in time. And this may also have global impact because, as I say, this is unprecedented, right? So even if you say, okay, I've got multiple service providers who are global, based globally, it also does have an impact because half the world or more is now on lockdown. Your local provider, your global provider may also be affected. So it's not an easy thing, but ultimately the consideration is we need to think about planning ahead. Think about the alternative security service providers that we need to be able to contract with and engage on a very fast basis in order to fulfill periods where there's additional demands. Half my workforce is under quarantine because someone's actually got a suspected case in that team. No problem. Let's invoke the contract with another service provider, which can then provide you that service, reducing the disruption to cybersecurity operations. Moving on. So what will cybersecurity teams have to deal with in the aftermath of COVID-19? Now, I found it difficult to actually classify this as a short-term or longer-term impact. So I put it somewhere in the middle. And this ultimately is what we describe as latent threats. So we talked about the first few issues, right? The remote working, the rollout of new technology implementations without sufficient thought and controls. We talked about how people are not always perhaps on the ball or have time to be focused on their job. We talked about how cyber criminals are also trying to increase their methods and sophistication and frequency of the attacks. That was compounded then by disruption in cybersecurity supply chain. So that leads me to what we call latent threats. And latent threats basically means that we must assume that because of those issues that we saw in those first few points that I made, we have been compromised. And so ultimately, opportunistic attacks may have already occurred to organizations where cybercriminals will already have taken advantage of, rolling out new mobile devices, rolling out access to corporate networks to personal devices, other VPN issues, and they are already in our environment. And so the solution then, and what cybersecurity teams will have to be probably busy with when maybe the MCO is lifted or even now, is a concept of what we call threat hunting. Okay, some people may refer to it as compromise assessments, and this is a concept that assumes that your networks have already been breached. Somewhere out there on someone's system, an attacker has already controlled that machine and is then primed to continue their attacks on a greater scale. So I'll illustrate this by a diagram here. So this is just a mock network diagram, very simplistic. And ultimately, on the left-hand side, you see perhaps a cyber criminal trying to infect some of your users, which are on the right-hand side. And so what happens is the cyber criminal, through the things that we talked about, all the phishing links, etc., then manages to gain access to one of your users' machines on the right-hand side. That machine is now already owned by the attacker. He controls that machine fully. In order for that attacker to actually tell the machine what to do next, he has to establish what we call command and control communication. You see that in diagram up there, CNC communication. And that's really communication from the hacked machine back out to the attacker. One of the things that the attacker normally also does, you see the numerous circles on this diagram and the arrows, is often the first victim that they've hacked is not someone who actually has a lot of access on their machine, a lot of confidential documents on their machine. They try to then do what we call lateral movement and jump to another person's machine, jumping all the way until they find that critical server or that server which has confidential information, and then sending it out back to the attacker, as you see from the arrows. So the concept of threat hunting or compromise assessment, as we put it, is to really think about, can we actually spot which machines are actually sending out that command and control communication out to the attacker. Now, I make this sound trivial, but it's not, because obviously attackers also know how to hide their tracks. But ultimately, this is something we need to try and do. Find those machines which are already showing signs of command and control communication, dig out those machines, clean them up, because then you cut the ability of the attacker to move laterally and move to the other assets. Yeah? So ultimately, assume we've been breached, find those machines that are compromised, clean them up. Concept called threat hunting or compromise assessments. Now, if you're in the financial service industry, you know that the Bank Negara Malaysia RMIT document actually has a section on requiring big organizations, big financial institutions to actually perform compromise assessments or threat hunting on a periodic basis. And COVID-19 or no COVID-19, this is in recognition that it's really hard to defend. We have to assume that we've been breached. So then, talking through on the other thing that we will face as we get out of MCO, as we get back to work, is that we'll find that risk tolerance from alternative service providers may have been relaxed. So in the scramble to actually get some sort of normalcy or operations back on track in the business environment, some of our people in the business may actually have invited um, alternative or contingency providers, right? So your normal service provider is out of business or can't serve you, you get another service provider from a business sense. Now, often because of the rush, all of these alternative contingency providers may not have been subject to the same security requirements as before. So think about a particular vendor or service provider who have access to your systems, right? In the past, you may have done a lot of due diligence in ensuring that third party or service provider has good security controls on their end to also safeguard how they access your environment. In the times that have passed, obviously, because we're in a rush to onboard, say, a new service provider, a new vendor, we may have relaxed those security requirements in order to ensure operational continuity. And so the issue then is to, as we move forward, to plan ahead. Work with your business to actually think about who are the contingent service providers that they are engaging from a business or operational perspective, and think about rolling out your security due diligence over those particular third parties and vendors upfront before you even have to face a situation where they have to be invoked to provide these services. Okay, I will move on. So another theme of what we wanted to explore in terms of the longer term impact or reactions to the economic climate. And this is the final theme. What impact will the forecasted economic slowdown have on cybersecurity? So this is fairly obvious: reduce or reallocated security spend. And obviously, as you know, no organization, well, virtually no organization can probably go a few months or more than that without actually earning any sort of revenue. So there will, of course, be globally a forecasted recession. There will be, of course, a lot of cost cutting from organizational perspectives. The first thing that often goes out the window, unfortunately, is security, right? Because it doesn't contribute to revenue generation. It doesn't actually contribute to the value that the organization brings. It's a support service, necessary though it may be. It probably will be overlooked in favor of other more pressing needs. And as that happens, ultimately, we may, like the supply chain issue, then face to under-resourcing of the security functions, which, as we mentioned before, contributes to greater digital risk because we need people ultimately to operate these controls. And similar to the fourth point, what we need to really think about is how do we think about our security program model, and how do we actually think about what is the best model, whether in-source or outsource, to ensure that the most key security operations continue to operate even on a tight budget. One of the things that you may consider doing, of course, is to talk to particular service providers and, of course, negotiate something upfront, in which case they can come in and help you as and when required, back to the earlier point, to fulfill periods of additional demand, perhaps at a good rate if you start doing it on a longer term basis. Other things related to economic impacts is increase in opportunistic M&A activity. So obviously you will have small organizations or smaller organizations who are probably feeling a lot of effects on their I guess their revenue and their bottom lines and top lines right now. And so in the months ahead, we will probably see larger organizations start to think about acquiring or merging with these other organizations in order to perhaps gain synergies or perhaps build capabilities that they've always wanted to build, and probably now is a good time. And the issue with that, of course, is as these M&A activities actually happen, as companies merge, there is going to be cybersecurity impacts. Organizations, of course, normally in any part of a merger and acquisition needs to go through a cybersecurity due diligence, where you, of course, have to evaluate whether or not that organization has been breached before, whether that organization that you're merging or acquiring has good security controls, etc. Unfortunately, this may be something which may be overlooked in the process of trying to aggressively pursue that M&A activity. And so a lesson from the past, this is of course not related to COVID-19, but back in 2016, Marriott of course decided to acquire a few hotel chains, Starwood Resorts Worldwide, not knowing that Starwood, so these organizations had actually been compromised in the past. Attackers had already been there 2 years prior to the acquisition. They continued to be in the newly merged organization 2 years after that merger and acquisition happened. And ultimately, it was well publicized. Marriott, of course, had a huge data breach, lots of publicity, negative publicity, but there was nothing they could do about it because ultimately the companies that they merged or acquired with had already been compromised 2 years prior to, or 4 years prior to the incident actually taking place. So ultimately, M&A has risks, which then brings me to my point then, in the pursuit of that opportunistic M&A activity, we should of course not neglect our cybersecurity due diligence. So some of the things that we talk about is thinking through, who's actually targeting the organization that we're merging or acquiring. Thinking through, what that means for an organization as we integrate with that new organization that we are merging with. The compromise assessment is the concept I mentioned earlier, is also obviously important. Thinking through, hey, if I'm acquiring or merging with this company, should I actually do a compromise assessment or threat hunt right now to actually just know whether that organization has been compromised and maybe eradicate that threat before this M&A goes through to avoid a Marriott type situation. And of course, the third point at the bottom is ensuring that we do security control assessments, policy and procedure, harmonization and integration and all that. So the last one with regards to the economic and financial impacts, this is unfortunate. This is not something I like to talk about, but ultimately there will be layoffs and as a result, potentially disgruntled employees. And the impact of that, something slightly unrelated, is also changes in IT and business operating environment in the long term. So we talked about all this stuff around remote working, working from home, the cybersecurity supply chain. All of this actually has a long-term impact on our defenses and how we actually operate the company operationally and from a cybersecurity perspective. So I address two of these points together. So with regards to the first point, layoffs and disgruntled employees. So as people cut jobs, as organizations cut salaries and etc., there are going to be people who are either unhappy or perhaps good targets for cyber criminals because they are now perhaps enticed or have a better motivation to actually help perform malicious acts. What do I mean? So this is again something which is around COVID-19 or no COVID-19. There are dark web forums out there. There are scenarios where attackers actually want to pay employees to leak corporate secrets, pay employees to actually ensure that they can get a foothold within the organization. So give them admin passwords and more security related information about that company. Unfortunately, employees do these things, COVID-19 or no COVID-19. If you look at the example on the right, this is actually one of the well-known dark web forums called Kika's Marketplace, where people actually entice insiders to actually give them information. And this could include things like credentials. It could include things like corporate secrets. It could also include things like non-public information. So, for example, things which may make share prices go up or down. That facilitates insider trading on the part of the malicious actor. And I find out, for example, that Apple's actually going to launch the new iPhone a month from now, and that's non-public. I buy Apple shares, I make money off that. But to do that, I entice your employees to actually give me that information in the first place. So ultimately, these things are already around. And what with people being desperate because of job cuts, and also maybe remuneration cuts. So ultimately, we're going to see more of this as a threat. The second point I wanted to make is, I talked about this earlier, increase BYOD, bring your own device schemes within organizations, increase adoption of cloud, increase adoption of remote working does actually change the IT and business operating environment. Are we as a cybersecurity organization, are we as cybersecurity defenders equipped to actually take to actually cater for these changes is what we discuss in the considerations. So with regards to the considerations, a few things that organizations can think about in light of the layoffs or the disgruntled employees is to think about the technologies that can help them. So technologies which are now out there these days include something what we call DLP, data loss prevention. So think of the scenario whereby one of your employees gets hold of credit card information or IC numbers, something sensitive, tries to upload it to Google Cloud or some sort of cloud technology or email out to himself. Data loss prevention, very simplistically, of course, is a solution which inspects what's going out, blocks it, and then tries to ensure that data doesn't actually go out. The other thing that companies are now potentially looking at is what we call UEBA technologies. So UEBA stands for User and Entity Behavioral Analytics. So one of the key challenges we find in cybersecurity at any point in time is how do you actually tell legitimate action from a non-legitimate action? So say, for example, someone actually goes to work every day, opens 10 files a day. That might be normal activity. But UEBA solutions are intended to find out what is normal activity and then detect abnormal activity. So I'll give you an example, if someone actually opens 5 files, 10 files a day, if suddenly that user account actually starts opening 10, hundreds of files a day, is that potentially malicious activity? Maybe. And that's what UEBA technologies seek to detect and allow you to respond to mitigate those threats. And as we think about the increased change in our IT and business operating environment, so increasing BYOD, cloud, remote work, etc., we need to think about the security appliances that we have right now. A lot of security appliances, all the firewalls, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. You've also got security incident and event management, those sort of tools which are meant to help detect security incidents. If our organization has now changed and our technologies have now changed to the point where how we used to operate is not normal anymore, and we have to think about how we work now, are the rule sets, are the capabilities of our security appliances still valid? So ultimately, we need to think about tuning and developing these security appliances to make sure that they are now effective given the change in the business and IT operating environment that we now live in. And finally, as you implement these new controls and change how you monitor and detect such malicious activity, you of course have to periodically assess how effective these new controls are, bearing in mind that you are probably going to be implementing new types of procedural or even technical or even process-based controls. There has to be a process to actually ensure that these controls are effective. So I've come to the end of my one large slide. And the point I wanted to make as we look through all of these areas is this. If I may comment on it myself, if you look at this, if you take away COVID-19, all of these things are actually fairly common things. All of these things are considerations, whether or not we've got COVID-19 or we don't. So the point is, cybersecurity is always pretty much the same at any given time. The controls, everything that we look at cybersecurity today applies now, applies in medium term, applies going forward. But the thing is, cybersecurity is not a one-time thing. Cybersecurity is a program, and you periodically have to think about how you tweak that program, how you think about the new risks that you face, and alter that program to cater for the new normal. Right? So as I say, all of these things, looking through it, you can talk about it in light of a non-COVID-19 situation, but what is required is to think about how that is going to change going forward as part of a reactive and proactive cybersecurity program. So in summary, I suppose we will talk, I'll just summarize. We talked about a few themes, right? So how has COVID-19 impacted our work culture and changed cybersecurity? We talked about the remote working and availability disruptions from working from home, new technologies being adopted too fast, etc. We talked about the cyber criminals and what they're up to these days. I showed you some examples of real life scenarios where these cyber criminals are trying to entice for financial gain, impersonating authorities, etc. Talked about how the lockdown and disruption in supply chains affects cybersecurity because your service providers may not be operating 100% anymore. And obviously the thing to think about is how do we actually have alternative service providers in the future to cater for additional demand. We talked about what cybersecurity teams will have to deal with right now and as we get out of MCO potentially. And the concept is latent threats where your organization may and probably has already been compromised because of the weaknesses that we saw. And also the increased risk from alternative service providers commissioned by the business as they rushed to get continuity in operations from new service providers and they've relaxed those security requirements. And finally, as I suppose a larger theme, what impact will the forecasted economic slowdown have on cybersecurity? We talked about how there will be reallocated and reduced cybersecurity spend. We talked about potential rush for M&A activity and how in the case of Marriott, that could also happen to our organizations. And finally, we talked about, unfortunately, the increase in insider threats and new business and operating environments. And are we in a position to actually be able to detect that shift in trend? So with that, I have finished my talk. I suppose I will hand back to Nadia and open up for any questions.
Thank you very much for that, CK. I think the one main takeaway I have before we open up to the questions, by the way, we have a lot of questions, is that there'll be bad actors no matter what the scenario. And actually, it strikes me that you're right. These are matters we should have been caring about anyway.
Yeah.
COVID-19 or not COVID-19, but I do think the one thing this pandemic has kind of unveiled to a lot of us is the fundamental weaknesses in a lot of the structure that we either put to the side for a while or we could have survived with band-aids over it at this point. So clearly that is something we can't keep doing, right?
Well,
for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is in a way a wake-up call for a lot of organizations. I think both in the business environment as well as in the cybersecurity environment to think about, that the assumptions that we made in the past, the kind of controls that we put in place may not always apply. And I suppose part of a good cybersecurity program, as I mentioned earlier, is to be proactive. It is to be looking at evolving threats. And so very early on, the organizations which are probably doing well right now, and suppose no one's really doing well, but maybe people who get a bit more sleep right now are those organizations who back in November, December, when this crisis first started to think about what could potentially happen and what they should do to anticipate it. And I say this not just from a cybersecurity sense, but also from a business and operational perspective.
So in that vein, Esri Noor Hussain actually asks, will our current cybersecurity environment be ready to face the evolving cybercrimes and threats to come? I mean, in general, are we ready in any kind of way, or we're always playing catch up?
So again, I suppose with with cybersecurity, COVID-19 or no COVID-19, we've always been playing catch up, and that's the unfortunate thing. And we'll probably always be playing catch up. The the ultimate issues we always see, again, COVID-19 or no COVID-19, is the asymmetry in terms of resources. We as cybersecurity defenders of the organization are often constricted by things like protocols, budgets, compliance requirements, lack of resources, etc. But of course, cyber threats, cyber criminals have no such restrictions. They have vast amounts of money. They are very determined. And so ultimately, we are never able to always match up against these cyber criminals. Um, and the other issue, of course, is we have to think about evolving threats and changes in technology, COVID-19 or no COVID-19, and it's always an uphill battle. So ultimately, we talked a lot about the fundamentals of a risk-based, evolving cybersecurity program. Right, to think about what we need to do right now to evolve our cybersecurity awareness, to think also ahead of things like the technologies that we need to put in place and what could actually happen to our organizations. So it's a tough question. There is no easy answer to that question. But as I say, it's not a COVID-19 discussion.
All right, we have this question here from Hanish Shamira, who's the head of corporate services at K&M Group. What are the red flags to know if it is a phishing or a scammer? Because they have gotten very sophisticated, especially since now we're working from home and we can't sort of knock on the door of our IT guy and ask whether something is kosher.
Okay, well, so again, I suppose with COVID-19 or no COVID-19, it's always been the same. There are some fundamental practices that you can do. There's always the things we think about. Number one, of course, hover over those links. Number two, think about what the person is asking for. Often, cyber criminals, cyber threats will send you phishing emails or some sort of message, which often involves some sort of urgent action. Do this now, otherwise something will happen. And often that rush, that inducement to make you rush is, of course, to cloud your judgment so that you will fall prey to that attack. Ultimately, so if
to make you panic, ultimately.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you see that sort of pressing need or urgency, often it is because of a cyber threat. The other obvious one, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, is things like grammar and spelling. Of course, we talk about how cyber criminals are more sophisticated these days, probably have better English, but there are often some telltale signs of how spelling and wording and phrases that are being used may actually belie a phishing attack. Giving an example of one of the cases we were looking at in the past, we saw particular phishing emails that, somebody actually pretended to be the CEO of that company, sent an email to one of the employees saying, okay, please transfer money urgently, right? One red flag that I talked about. Please bypass all protocols that we've implemented because this is urgent. But the most telling thing in the end was the CEO actually signed off with a phrase. I can't remember what the phrase was, which actually wasn't something which someone like the CEO, given what race he was, his education level, actually would sign off on, right? So telltale signs would also be the kind of language being used and phrases in that email.
Okay, right. We've got a couple questions here from Alvin Hugh and Jeffrey Ng. It's about the same kind of vein. So basically, Jeffrey's asking, how can a company protect downside via insurance or others for such cybersecurity breaches? And Alvin asked that what are the key areas that a board directors need to especially be aware of and look more into in terms of cybersecurity? So basically, on a board and a company thing, how can we be protected, but how can we also sort of look forward?
Okay, so there are a couple of questions there. So can you repeat the first one, please?
So basically, Jeffrey is actually asking, how can a company protect downside via insurance or other sort of breaches? And Alvin's asking, what happens? What kind of controls can we put in, or actually ask the board to look for when it comes to cybersecurity?
Okay, so the first one, I suppose, is in regard to cyber insurance, which is becoming quite a hot thing at this point in time. So of course, organizations will be encouraged to actually look at cyber insurance, and to think about what kind of protections it can offer the organization. Of course, you have to think about the cost benefit analysis, because if you think about cyber insurance, if the premiums are too expensive and it costs more, and often that the premiums are only relaxed slightly if you can demonstrate that you've got good cybersecurity controls. So ultimately, if you have to spend so much money actually implementing all of these cybersecurity controls, you may as well just focus on that rather than think about the insurance. Yeah? And the other thing to think about insurance is there is a limit in terms of what it covers. So you think about what cyber insurance typically covers. It may cover things like maybe the investigation that you suffer. It may cover that you have to invoke in order to investigate and clean up the incident. It will cover things like perhaps legal costs. It may cover to a certain extent maybe some contractual obligations potentially. Okay. But the issue with cyber insurance is those are only surface level costs that an organization will face in the event of a cyber breach. There are a lot of hidden costs that you won't actually see immediately, and cyber insurance won't cover. So think about the loss of customers, the loss of productivity from a cyber attack, the loss of income from future contracts, and the overall negative perception, which causes you to lose customers, regulatory fines, whatever, that would happen in the event of a cyber breach. Sorry, I've said a lot about that, but ultimately, yes, cyber insurance should be considered. You need to think about the upsides and downsides, but ultimately, cyber insurance or no cyber insurance, there's going to be a lot of impacts which are under the radar, so to speak, that cyber insurance doesn't actually cover.
Okay.
Okay.
There's a couple of other things as well. There's this couple of questions that talk about the legal side of it. So Pushpa actually asked what's within the organization's scope, and was actually within the power of maybe the telco or the service provider. So basically, when you sort of parcel it out, what responsibility goes where? Where does the buck stop for a company in terms of as much as they can do to protect cybersecurity, and how much of it is outside forces?
Mm. Well, that's a tough question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to be able to answer that, because there are also lawyers who focus on cybersecurity who would be better placed to answer that. So in the risk of saying something wrong, I'd rather not answer that question. I would say to a certain extent, we do have some sort of control over parts of the devices that our users use. So for instance, if you're using a personal mobile device to actually
Mm.
access a corporate network, then obviously there will be things like accepting the policies of the organization, accepting that this device should now be monitored by the company, etc. And I guess such agreements are potentially legally binding, such that if a user neglects to or breaks those good practices or requirements, then potentially that there is some legal recourse, right? But I think it's fairly limited. I won't say any more beyond that, and I think would be a better question to be answered by a legal advisor focusing on cybersecurity, of which there are.
Fair enough. But thank you for educating me. I didn't realize that there were lawyers that actually had very specific for this particular part of cybersecurity. But thanks for that. A couple more questions before we wrap up for this afternoon. Esther Yap actually asked, saying that clues on phishing sites may be easily identified at times, like you say, imposter emails, wrong spelling, just very odd behavior. But how could we know if correctly spelled icons or unsuspicious links are secured? Basically, how we were talking about the sophistication aspect of it, right? How can we bring ourselves one step more?
Well, um, so of course there's the basic one where if you are going through your web browser, you should see that there's a HTTPS there. That's the most basic
Okay.
one. But ultimately, it's a very difficult area to protect, because if we think about the kind of malware that can affect mobile devices these days, right? You download a piece of software from Apple App Store or Google Play. It turns out to be malicious. It can actually overlay legitimate applications whereby you see your internet banking page. You think it's from Maybank or CIMB or whoever, but actually it's the attacker's app. Right. So then the question becomes, should you have actually implemented that, installed an app in the first place? And the answer is, of course, to always just ensure that you are installing legitimate applications. So it's a big problem. Ultimately, it's a problem in cybersecurity, COVID or no COVID, because the users and end user devices are always the weakest link. Yeah. So
Okay.
it's a tough one to answer, but ultimately that's why we think about, when you look at any cybersecurity program, there's always the protect, the detect, and the recover. And I say recover, it could include things like cleanup. And the reason why we have those three, I suppose, aspects is the fact that you cannot protect 100%. There's always going to be this instance where someone has fallen prey to a malicious link, no matter how much you train them. There's always
Yeah.
instances whereby you tell your users, or you control their mobile devices, but somehow they've managed to install something which compromises their network. And we talked about how there's the emerging discipline of threat hunting or compromise assessment, right? And that's in recognition of the fact that you cannot protect, you cannot prevent, you have to be able to detect and respond ultimately. Yeah. So no one right answer to that question. It is a continuum of protect, detect, recover.
Okay. One final question before we sort of end the session. Francis is asking, now that work from home looks like it's going to be a current new normal, or at least for a while, or at least, I think once companies do realize that you can do partly work from home, a lot of people's SOPs, I think, are going to change after this is all over. What precautions should companies take in order to avoid adverse implications? You've spoken a lot about the stuff that we can do, but let's say you are trying to communicate it to everybody from the top rung to the bottom rung of your organization. What's the simplest way to what's the main best practices that you can communicate to everybody in the organization as a caution, so that you are not open to such scams?
Tough question. Tough question.
Correct, because you're trying to tell everyone. Okay, I think that's the thing. You can do all the stuff, but you need to communicate it to everyone in a way that I suppose it strikes them, or they can sort of take to heart.
So ultimately, so step aside from remote working, step aside from COVID-19. If we talk about cybersecurity these days, that there is a huge drive to do security awareness, right? We are drilled to actually spot phishing emails, etc., to the point where we receive all these emails from IT security, and we are literally just tired of it, right?
Yes.
But there's also the component whereby a lot of organizations nowadays do what we call social engineering exercises, where you ultimately drill your employees. You run actual phishing attacks against your employees on a mock basis to then identify, who's actually clicked on those links, who's fallen prey, and then you teach them what they should have looked out for, right? So such drills, of course, are important to actually exercise rather than just provide that kind of theory. And I guess going forward, when we talk about remote working and the threats that we are facing at this point in time, how do we communicate? Well, it would be in the usual means, right? Ensuring that you've got policies in place, ensuring that you provide that periodic communication. But perhaps the kind of drills that you do going forward has to perhaps be tweaked, whereby you run a phishing simulation through, say, a SMS to your end user's mobile device, potentially, right? And so as people are drilled on cybersecurity, it becomes muscle memory, right? So if you see a email from your ID security department and it looks like a phishing email, and you think, they've been doing this for like 10 times every month, it's a phishing email, I'm just going to delete it. Well, if it was a real attacker, they've actually deleted the real attacker's email. So the kind of cyber drills that we run actually, in a way, do work. Um, they have its users, and the more you do it, the more people actually exercise it.
Thank you very much. I think it's a great note to end on that. Thank you, CK. I feel that honestly, we are fighting a battle on multiple fronts, but it's great to know that at least we are sort of all doing it together. With that, we've come to the end of our webinar for today. Thank you so much for everybody who attended and their participation and questions. We do apologize that we're not able to accommodate absolutely everyone, but still, you have made it a very, very lively afternoon. But please feel free to go through the chat box. There's quite a few comments and things there. We've had a number of active discussions take place there as well. Also, as always, we'd love to hear from you. There's a survey link in the chat box, or there's a QR code scan that you can actually use to provide your feedback and maybe topics of interest. I keep saying this, and I think it's a good reminder that there is going to be an online program series from ICDM. Watch this space. If you're interested, you can email development@icdm.com.my or visit icdm.com.my. There'll be another webinar series, same time, same place tomorrow. Our speaker for then will be Sunil Puri, who's the head of research, Apex Center for Creative in Singapore. See you at the next webinar. Be safe, everyone. Protect yourself and your loved ones. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.